Imagine an abyss so ancient, so deep, that even scientists hesitate to classify it as a simple geological formation, a hidden hole in the very bowels of the earth, buried for millions of years under layers of rock, mud, and silence, a void that remained unreachable, elusive until now, and what was found there should not exist, not under any circumstances, according to everything we know about evolution, archaeology, and human history. But the most disturbing part is not what was seen, it's what was heard, and what, to this day, remains unexplained. In 2023, an expedition led by a group of independent speleologists accidentally found what initially seemed to be just another natural crevice in a remote mountain range in Central Asia. But as the days passed, and they descended deeper and deeper, they realized this was no ordinary cave, nor a geological accident. The internal walls bore symmetrical marks, clean cuts, geometric patterns that appeared to have been made with intent. But by whom? Or by what? There, hundreds of meters below the surface, they found something that not only defied the laws of geology, but also called into question everything we know about our own origins, surrounding the whole, fossilized bones of human species that shouldn't even have existed at that time. Rudimentary tools, carved with astonishing precision, dated to over 350,000 years ago, and deeper still, traces of a structure that cannot be explained as the result of natural processes, a sculpted stone hall with columns, pillars supporting the void. As if it was a construction made by intelligent hands. The world doesn't know about this discovery. Few have had access to the confidential reports. The leaked images were quickly removed from the internet, and those who dared to speak too much simply disappeared. What you are about to hear now is a narrative that was never meant to be told. The full story of the prehistoric hole that could change everything we know about human origins. Prepare to descend into the depths of a mystery as ancient as humanity itself. But first, a warning: after hearing this story, you will never look at the past the same way again. Now, let's begin. It all began with a mistake, a miscalculation, or perhaps an inevitable calling. The group led by Viktor Morozov, an experienced Russian speleologist, was aiming to map a chain of caves extending beneath the Altai Mountains along the Russia-Mongolia border. The expedition was routine: enter, map, collect samples, and exit. Nothing out of the ordinary, until one of the drones sent to probe a crevice abruptly disappeared. The monitor, which transmitted real-time footage from the drone, simply went black. But seconds before, a disturbing sound was recorded, a kind of metallic resonance, as if something down there had responded. Victor, ever the skeptic, attributed the sound to magnetic interference, very common in underground environments. But the support team, especially the young bioacoustics researcher, Leela Shams, couldn't ignore that noise. She described it as not natural, not random, a sequence. Determined to understand what had caused the drone's disappearance, and intrigued by the strangeness of the sound, Victor and two team members decided to descend through the crevice, a narrow space, barely wide enough for a person with gear. With ropes and equipment, they began the descent. What they didn't know was that this tight entrance was merely the vestibule of a nightmare. After about 30 meters, the crevice suddenly widened, revealing a vertical shaft so vast that their flashlights couldn't even reach the bottom. The laser measurement indicated more than 200 meters deep, but the sensors kept failing as they tried to obtain precise data. Leela suggested waiting, analyzing the risks, planning a strategy, but Victor didn't want to waste time. To him, that hole was just another vertical cave, like so many he had explored in his life. He secured the safety rope, adjusted his harness, and began to descend. With each meter down, the temperature dropped drastically, the air grew thin, and then about 150 meters below the surface, Victor stopped abruptly. His helmet had touched something. It wasn't rock, it wasn't soil, it was a smooth surface, cold and carved, shining his light on the wall. Before him, Victor froze, as if time itself had stopped. There, carved into the solid rock, was a geometric pattern, concentric circles, connected by straight lines, and, at the center, what appeared to be a stylized representation of an eye. Victor didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but the pattern was there, undeniable, intact, as if it had been carved recently, and not hundreds of thousands of years ago, as later analyses would indicate. Without immediately reporting to the team, he continued descending, but what he found further down would seal the fate of that expedition. At about 220 meters, the shaft widened again, and it was no longer a vertical descent, but rather a colossal opening extending laterally, forming an underground hall so vast that the beam of his flashlight seemed swallowed by the darkness. But there was more, much more. Victor noticed that the floor of that chamber wasn't raw stone, but carved blocks, large slabs of black rock, perfectly cut and fitted, forming a regular and stable floor. And at the center, something that should never have been there, a structure about 3 meters high, composed of columns arranged in a perfect circle, and in the middle of them, a cubic block, with carvings similar to those Victor had seen on the wall. But something else caught his attention. On top of the block, an object completely out of place, covered by a thin layer of sediment, but visibly distinct, a lithic tool, a kind of primitive axe, but with marks indicating a level of craftsmanship far superior to what one would expect from an artifact of that antiquity. Victor, now overcome by a mixture of fascination and fear, picked up the object with his gloved hands. It was lighter than it looked, and as he lifted it, the echo returned, that same sound captured before, but now stronger. As if the abyss itself had responded to his action. Victor immediately dropped the object, frightened. The sound ceased, but something inside him knew that place was not a natural space, and worse, it was not uninhabited. On the surface, Leela and the others completely lost contact with Victor. The communication systems, until then functional, went silent, and the last recorded statement was a whispered phrase filled with indescribable tension. "I'm not alone." It took more than 12 hours for the rescue team to descend to the point where Victor had disappeared, but when they arrived, they found no one. No Victor, no equipment, no object. The only thing left was the carved pattern on the wall and the footprints, human footprints leading deeper into the chamber and not coming back. This was only the beginning. From here on, the expedition would turn into a nightmare, and the discovery into a secret that many would wish to bury again forever. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. After Viktor Morozov's disappearance, news of the discovery quickly leaked into restricted circles within the scientific and military communities. It couldn't have been otherwise. The leader of one of the most respected speleology teams vanished in a previously uncharted location with no plausible explanation. But officially, nothing happened. The press never learned of the event. The Russian government and the scientific consortium funding the expedition declared that Victor had withdrawn from the mission and quietly returned to Russia. A lie, a carefully constructed lie, aimed at one single goal: buying time. In secret, a new expedition was organized, this time, not only speleologists, but also military personnel, experts in archaeology, paleontologists, and, discreetly, anthropologists specialized in lost civilizations. The operation was commanded by an enigmatic figure, Colonel Sergei Volkov, known for leading exploration missions in high-risk regions, such as the Arctic and the deserts of Siberia. Volkov wasn't a scientist. He was a man of action, and above all, an executor. The expedition departed by helicopter, with enough logistical support to remain for weeks in the inhospitable Altai Mountains region. The site was isolated, and the entrance to the crevice where Victor had disappeared was sealed with temporary gates, guarded by armed soldiers. The objective was clear: to descend to the point where Victor was last seen, to understand what was down there, and, if possible, to bring something back. But what they found surpassed even the worst nightmares. Descending through the crevice, the new explorers followed precisely the same path Victor had taken. They found the same marks, the same carved geometric patterns, and the same suffocating cold that seemed to drain the energy of anyone daring to enter that void. But when they reached the underground hall, they realized it wasn't the same. The stone slabs that formed the floor were now partially covered by a strange layer of viscous moisture, as if the environment had been invaded by an organic force and anomalous dampness, unlike any common infiltration. And at the center, the circular structure was still there, but the cubic block Victor had described was no longer present. In its place, a void, and around it, more footprints, but now confused, intertwined. As if several people or things had circulated there since the last incursion. Colonel Volkov ordered the area to be mapped with millimetric precision. Long-range cameras, motion sensors, and acoustic transmitters were installed to capture any sound or vibration. But before they could complete the setup, one of the soldiers sweeping the hole found something no one expected. Between two partially displaced slabs was Viktor Morozov's helmet, and next to it, a piece of his climbing equipment. But there were no signs of a struggle, nor of an accident. Nothing. As if Viktor had simply vanished into thin air. The helmet was retrieved for analysis, but upon inspection, one of the technicians noticed something even more disturbing. On the inside, visible only under ultraviolet light, was a set of engraved symbols, forming a sequence that no one could decipher. And the most unsettling part, the symbols were identical to the patterns found on the walls of the shaft, as if Viktor had had the time and presence of mind to engrave them before disappearing. Or as if someone or something had done it afterward. Attempting to advance beyond the hall, the team identified a narrow passage, partially blocked by displaced blocks. After several hours of work with specialized tools, they managed to create enough space for two team members to pass through. On the other side, there wasn't simply more cave, but rather a corridor. A narrow corridor, with perfectly parallel walls, covered by the same geometric patterns, but now, with a striking difference. Instead of concentric circles, the inscriptions assumed forms resembling humanoid representations, elongated figures, with thin limbs, disproportionate heads, and eyes, always eyes. A huge, empty, cold Leela, who had been summoned again to accompany the expedition as a consultant, felt an uncontrollable shiver as she observed those images. She, who had dedicated her life to studying sound patterns in extreme environments, realized there was a hidden sequence in the arrangement of the figures. And then, she asked the question no one wanted to hear. What if this isn't just art? What if it's a message? Meanwhile, the acoustic sensors began to register a new pattern. Low-frequency sounds, inaudible to the human ear, but perceptible to the equipment. They were rhythmic, regular, like heartbeats. The colonel immediately ordered the passage to be sealed and everyone to retreat. But before they could complete the blockade, the lights went out. For about 40 seconds, everything remained immersed in absolute darkness, muffled screams, disordered movements, and then silence. When the emergency systems finally restored the lighting, one of the soldiers had disappeared. He had been just a few meters from the team, but now there was no trace of him. Nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, simply nothing. The colonel, gripped by tension, ordered the immediate evacuation of the site. But as they retreated through the shaft, the sound pattern recorded by the sensors intensified, becoming stronger, faster, until it turned into a deafening noise that penetrated the rock like a living pulse. The team managed to emerge to the surface with only minimal losses, but never located the missing soldier, nor Viktor. Nor any other clue about what had happened there. Upon returning to base, the reports were classified as ultra-secret. The site was sealed again, this time with reinforced concrete and steel structures, under express orders that no one should ever enter there again. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, one of the motion sensors accidentally left at the entrance of the crevice, began transmitting signals even with the passage blocked, movements, beats, and a recording. A sound, the same sound captured at the moment Viktor disappeared, but this time in the form of a voice. A phrase whispered in ancient Russian. They never left. From this point on, there was no more denying it. The prehistoric hole was hiding something, or someone, that remained and perhaps still remains alive. After the second expedition and the inexplicable disappearance of one of the soldiers, the site was officially declared off limits, sealed under tons of concrete and steel, catalogued as a zone of extreme geological risk, and removed from all official maps. But behind the scenes, not everyone accepted this closure. Leela Shams, deeply shaken but driven by a growing obsession, simply couldn't forget what she had seen. The marks, the humanoid figures, the sounds. In her mind, everything indicated that this wasn't just an anomalous geological formation. It was a message, a record, perhaps even a warning. In the months that followed, she managed to clandestinely access part of the sound recordings captured by the sensors that had been left behind. And after weeks of analyzing acoustic patterns, applying filters and bioacoustic interpretation models, Leela made a discovery that froze her blood. The sounds were not random, nor natural. They followed a rhythmic structure that resembled language. More specifically, the patterns corresponded to frequencies associated with early cognitive development, levels of communication that anthropologists had, until then, believed belonged solely to the first hominid groups. But there was something more. It wasn't a rudimentary language. It was sophisticated, organized in blocks, with repetitions and variations indicating intent. Leela sent her analyses to Dr. Henry Koslov, one of the world's leading authorities in paleoanthropologic linguistics. Koslov, initially skeptical, refused to believe it. But upon receiving the recordings, he completely changed his stance. In his response, just one sentence: either you are facing a fraud or a discovery that redefines the concept of humanity. Meanwhile, at the military facility that stored the expedition's records, Colonel Volkov, under pressure from superiors who didn't comprehend the true magnitude of it, ordered all data to be archived and forgotten. But it was already too late. Before the facility was isolated, someone, to this day no one knows who, managed to copy part of the files: images of the underground hall, records of human footprints, and most disturbingly, photos of new marks found during the second expedition. Because yes, when the official team entered the hall, in addition to the geometric patterns and humanoid figures, there was also something new. Recent marks made after the first incursion, made, perhaps during the first incursion, on the walls of the lateral corridor. Someone, or something, had scratched new symbols. This time, the figures were different, more aggressive, asymmetrical, with curved strokes suggesting movement, violence, rupture. And among them, what appeared to be an unequivocal graphic representation of a human being swallowed by a crevice. Leela, upon receiving these images from an anonymous source, was paralyzed. The marks, according to her analysis, were consistent with carvings made less than 6 months earlier, meaning they were made after the expedition or during Victor's disappearance. But there was something even more unsettling. In one of the images, magnified to the maximum, Leela noticed a detail no one else had seen. Next to one of the symbols, a fragment of fabric, partially embedded in the wall, a faded piece of cloth, but with a recognizable pattern. It was the logo from the vest Viktor Morozov had worn during the expedition, meaning he had been there, not just missing, but present after his supposed loss of contact. And then, the question that had been haunting everyone gained new force: did Viktor truly disappear, or is he still there? While these secret analyses circulated among a few specialists, new information leaked, satellite images showing a change in the terrain around the entrance of the hole, even after the complete sealing. As if the ground was sinking, just a few centimeters per week, but enough to create an inexplicable geological anomaly. Thermal images captured by sensors also showed something even more disturbing: a gradual increase in temperature in the area around the crevice, incompatible with the region's environmental conditions, as if something was moving down there. Or worse, growing. Pressed by this new data, Leela sought support from international organizations, trying to convince colleagues to organize a third expedition. But officially, no one wanted to get involved. The site was too dangerous, the reports were inconclusive, and the risks simply unacceptable. But Leela couldn't stop. She knew the truth was down there. She knew Viktor might be alive, or that he might have discovered something that transcended everything humanity knew about itself. So she did the unthinkable. She organized an unauthorized expedition. She enlisted two trusted colleagues, Jonas Falk, a specialist in geotechnical engineering, and Maria Ortega, an archaeologist with experience in deep excavations. Together, they planned to descend again through the same crevice, ignoring orders, military seals, and facing the unknown beneath the Altai Mountains. But what they didn't know is that since the last recorded event, no one who had entered that hole had ever returned. And yet, the site continued to respond, emitting signals, vibrations, and, at times, voices. What Leela, Jonas, and Maria would find upon reopening the sealed path would be far more than simple answers. It would be the beginning of the end. The night was cold, hostile, and silent. The Altai Mountains rose like millennial sentinels, indifferent to what was unfolding there. Leela Shams, Jonas Falk, and Maria Ortega were about to commit one of the greatest acts of scientific insubordination in modern history: to reopen the seal and enter the hole that should no longer exist. The site, though theoretically sealed and protected by remote monitoring, was momentarily unguarded. After months of inactivity and what seemed like a definitive blockade, military forces had relocated. Part of their operations and surveillance had been reduced. The opportunity was now or never. It took 6 hours of uninterrupted work to break through the layer of concrete and steel. Jonas, with his geotechnical engineering skills, led the process, attentive to every microfracture, every crack that could compromise the safety of access. And then, finally, the void revealed itself again. The air that escaped from the crevice was dense, filled with a smell that mixed mold, rust, and something else. Something none of them could identify, but that caused immediate nausea in Leela. They prepared the descent equipment. Jonas was the first to enter the crevice, followed by Maria. Leela was last, hesitant, but determined. Each meter descended increased the sense of oppression. The temperature plummeted, as if heat itself refused to remain there. After approximately 150 meters, they reached the point where Victor had found the first symbols. And, to everyone's surprise, they were no longer there. The walls, once marked by geometric patterns, were now smoothed out as if they had never been carved out, as if someone, or something, had erased the inscriptions, eliminating any trace of their existence. Maria froze, staring at the polished surface of the rock. "This is impossible," she whispered, almost voiceless, but it was, and there was more. As they passed the point where, in the previous expedition, they had found the underground hall, they noticed an even more drastic change. The hall was no longer there. In place of the vast stone chamber, there was now a new corridor, narrow, winding, descending even deeper, toward what seemed to be the very heart of the mountain. Leela, trembling, consulted the map she had obtained from previous missions. Nothing in those records indicated the presence of that corridor. It was as if the structure had reconfigured itself, as if it was alive. Jonas hesitated. Maria suggested turning back, that this level of anomaly was simply unacceptable. But Leela could no longer go back, not after everything she had seen, heard, and lost. Determined, she took the first step, entering the corridor that no human had ever mapped. The path was claustrophobic, with the walls progressively narrowing, to the point they had to squeeze through to advance. With each meter, the atmosphere became denser, the air thinner, and the sounder more present. Yes, the sound. That same noise captured by the sensors in the previous expedition. That deep, rhythmic pulse was now perfectly audible to the human ear. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. As if the mountain were alive and aware of the intrusion. After about 40 minutes advancing through the corridor, the space suddenly opened up, revealing a new chamber. But unlike the previous hall, this was not made of carved blocks. It was an organic formation. The walls pulsed slightly, covered by a viscous, translucent substance that seemed to breathe. The floor was irregular, strewn with debris that appeared to be remnants of bones. Leela fell to her knees, seized by a mix of horror and fascination. Jonas approached one of the walls, cautiously touching it. Upon contact, the surface reacted. It contracted, emitted a high-pitched, shrill sound, and then opened slightly, revealing a cavity where, inside, something glowed with a faint, pulsating light. Maria, who until then had maintained her composure, let out a muffled scream. This can't be natural. And for the first time since they began the descent, Leela agreed. At the center of the chamber, there was a peculiar formation, a kind of pedestal, made of the same organic material that covered the walls, and on it, an object. It looked like some kind of capsule. Similar to a giant seed, with veins pulsing faint light, as if something inside it was alive. Leela approached, hypnotized. She extended her hand, but before she could touch it, Jonas pulled her back abruptly. "Don't do that. We don't know what it is." But it was too late. As she got too close, the capsule opened. From its interior, no creature emerged, but an emanation, a thick, grayish gas that quickly filled the chamber. Jonas and Maria screamed, trying to retreat, but the space was too tight. Leela, overcome by dizziness, lost her balance, and fell to the ground. Everything became blurry, muffled, until silence. When Leela regained consciousness, she didn't know how much time had passed. The chamber was immersed in a strange penumbra, with the pulsating light now almost extinguished. Jonas and Maria were no longer there. She tried to stand up, but her body didn't fully respond. Her left arm was marked, with a pattern identical to the inscriptions that had disappeared from the walls. Above, concentric circles, and, at the center, an eye. Desperate, Leela tried calling out for her colleagues, but the only thing she heard was a sequence of whispers that seemed to come from all directions, and from none at the same time. And then the phrase, the same one Victor had supposedly uttered before disappearing. "I'm not alone." Only now it wasn't Victor saying it. It was the mountain itself. Leela, alone and marked, realized she had passed the point of no return. There was no way out anymore. There was no more ignoring it. The prehistoric hole was not just a geological Formation. It was something more. And whatever it was had awakened. Leela could barely breathe. The gas that had escaped from the capsule made the air dense, sticky, almost solid. Each breath was a struggle, each movement an almost superhuman effort. Her arm, marked by the strange pattern, burned as if it had been seared from within. But she knew she couldn't stop. Not here, not now. Her colleagues had vanished without a trace, and although instinct screamed for her to turn back, the deepest part of her mind knew there was no going back. The chamber where the capsule had opened now seemed alive. The walls pulsed, periodically releasing small amounts of that same gray gas, as if they were breathing, as if they were warning. Leela then noticed that behind the pedestal where the capsule had been, there was an opening, hidden by a translucent membrane that vibrated softly with each deep pulse emanating from the bowels of the earth. She approached, feeling the temperature drop even further, her skin prickling in what seemed like a final biological warning. But still, she raised her hand and passed through the membrane. On the other side, the abyss. It was no longer a corridor. It was no longer a chamber. It was a vast and infinite vertical cavity, so deep that Leela's flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. But unlike the initial shaft, this was not static. The walls were moving. Structures that at first glance seemed like natural rock formations now revealed themselves as organic protrusions, covered by a shiny, pulsating, almost liquid substance. Leela felt her legs weaken. The air vibrated around her, as if thousands of voices were whispering simultaneously, without words. Just sounds. Sounds that entered her mind, bypassing cognitive and emotional barriers. She realized then that she was facing what geologists would call a magmatic chamber. But there was no magma. There was something different. At the center of the abyss, dozens, perhaps hundreds of capsules similar to the one she had opened, were arranged in concentric circles, suspended by organic filaments connecting them to the living walls of the cavity. And inside them, Leela could make out forms, humanoid forms. They weren't fossils. They weren't sculptures. They were bodies, suspended, immersed in a dense amber-like liquid, preserved. But the most disturbing thing was that some were moving. Leela felt tears involuntarily stream down her face. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. And yet, it was. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the air. I-O-N-E of the capsules, the one closest to Leela, began to crack. First, small fissures, then larger cracks, like a web spreading across the surface. Leela instinctively recoiled, but the uneven and slippery ground caused her to lose balance. She fell heavily, hitting her head against a protrusion of living rock. For a few seconds, everything went dark. When she regained consciousness, the capsule had completely ruptured, and in front of her, standing a figure. The creature had human proportions, but was elongated with thin, almost skeletal limbs and translucent, slightly luminous skin, as if it were covered by the same viscous material that filled the chamber. The face had no common facial features. No mouth, no nose, only two enormous black eyes, without eyelids, that fixed directly onto Leela's eyes. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but she couldn't. Her body simply refused to obey. The creature tilted, its head slightly to the side, as if analyzing Leela, and then it took a step toward her. But it didn't attack. It simply raised one of its thin arms and pointed to its own chest. There, at the center of the translucent torso, a pattern. The same as the one marking Leela's arm. The concentric circles, and the eye. Leela then realized what it meant. The mark was not just a sign. It was a bond. And for the first time since she had entered that abyss, she felt something she hadn't expected. She wasn't afraid. She was connected. The creature, maintaining the gesture, began to slowly retreat toward the pulsating wall until, without any effort, it merged with it, disappearing as if it had never existed. Leela remained paralyzed for minutes or hours. She couldn't tell. When she finally managed to stand, she realized that the other capsules were also cracking, all of them, simultaneously. The ground began to shake slightly, like a heartbeat synchronized with the wall's pulsations. The ceiling, far above, exhaled a dense, cold mist, slowly descending and enveloping everything. And then, a voice, not a sound, not a whisper, but a voice, clear, direct, familiar. Leela, she turned abruptly, and saw, at the entrance of the chamber, Jonas, standing with a vacant stare, and the same pattern marked on both arms and on his chest. He raised his hand, just as the creature had done, and pointed to the living wall beside him. Leela understood. Without words, without resistance, she slowly walked toward him, to the point where the wall pulsed most intensely, and together, they disappeared. Leela took the final step, passing through the pulsating surface beside Jonas, and, in that instant, the world disappeared. There was no pain, no physical rupture, only the complete dissolution of everything she had understood as space, time, and matter. When she opened her eyes, or whatever now replaced her eyes, Leela realized she was no longer inside the mountain. There were no more rocks, no pulsating walls, no uneven floor. There was void. An infinite space, filled only with a dense, black mist that seemed neither to reflect nor absorb light. The sensation of gravity had vanished, and the very concept of up and down no longer made sense. She tried to speak, to call for Jonas, but her voice produced no sound at all. Leela then realized something even more terrifying. She no longer had a body, at least not a body in the biological sense she once knew. Her consciousness was there, present but dissonant, like an echo of herself wandering through a borderless space, and, in that void, forms began to appear, not solid, not physical, but patterns of light and shadow that organized themselves in spirals, like infinite fractals, unfolding and collapsing upon themselves. Each spiral seemed to contain entire worlds, and as Leela observed them, she realized she was seeing, or living, multiple realities simultaneously. She saw herself in various versions. In one, she was still a student, fascinated by the sounds of remote caves. In another, she was old, tired, lying in a hospital bed. In yet another, she was in that very hole, descending with Victor, as if everything had happened differently. Each reality seemed as real as the last, and, simultaneously, as illusory as a forgotten dream. Then, Leela realized she was not alone. The forms around her began to gain consistency, like vaguely human silhouettes, emerging from nowhere, sliding through the black mist. They were the others. First, she saw Jonas, but it wasn't the Jonas who had disappeared beside her. It was a multiple version of him, replicated infinitely, walking in opposite directions, merging with himself, fading and reappearing. Then Maria, and Victor, and dozens, perhaps hundreds of other human figures, some familiar, others completely unknown. Leela then understood the true nature of the whole. It wasn't just a geological formation, nor an underground shelter, nor a temple of ancient civilizations. It was the threshold, a gateway to a layer of reality that humans were never meant to access. As suddenly, the forms around her reorganized, creating a gigantic eye formed by thousands of entities spinning and adjusting, looking at her from infinity. And then, for the first time, she heard not with her ears, but directly in her mind the same phrase, repeated in unison by all those presences: "You are now part." The phrase reverberated within Leela like an absolute command, and at that moment, she felt her consciousness being disintegrated, absorbed by that entity composed of multiple beings. But as something interrupted the process. At the center of the eye formed by the entities, a distinct figure emerged, human. It was Victor, or what was left of him. He no longer had eyes, nor a mouth, but his presence was unmistakable. He extended his hand, a deformed, translucent hand, and, with superhuman effort, broke the cycle of assimilation that had begun to consume Leela. And then, for the first time, she heard his voice, weak, almost fading. "Don't follow." Before she could respond, the entity that formed the eye ruptured, transforming into a spiral of pure light that swallowed Victor completely, dissipating him into the void. Leela was hurled away, or at least it felt that way, until she once again found herself in absolute darkness. For a moment, she thought she had died, that her body, or what remained of it, had finally been absorbed by the prehistoric hole. But then, a familiar sound. She opened her eyes. She was again in the underground hall, the original chamber. As if nothing had happened, Leela looked around, confused and breathless. She was lying on the cold stone floor, a few meters from the capsule she had opened. Jonas and Maria were not there. And beside her, only her equipment intact. She felt her left arm. The mark was no longer there. For a second, Leela thought everything had been a delusion caused by the gas, a hallucinatory nightmare. But then, as she stood up, she saw, engraved on the wall behind the pedestal, a new mark, a spiral. And at its center, a symbol she had never seen before, not the eye, but a perfect circle, crossed by a vertical line. Leela approached, touching the symbol. And as she did, she heard a laugh. She turned, looking for the source, but she was alone. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly. The sound of subterranean breathing returned, like a warning that this reality had not ended. It wasn't a delusion. It wasn't a dream. The prehistoric hole had let her out. But why? Leela had no answers. But now she knew she had crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed, and that, even outside the chamber, even back on the surface, the hole would never let her go. Leela didn't remember how she had managed to get out of the crevice. The memories were fragmented, disconnected. The touch on the wall, the laughter, the ground trembling, and then light. Natural light, for the first time in days, or weeks, or years, she no longer knew. The sky above the Altai Mountains looked unreal, like a poorly finished painting, with colors too saturated to be true. She was alone. Jonas and Maria were not. There were no footprints, no traces, nothing, except for her own presence there, kneeling on the cold rock, her arm clean, unmarked, but with a heavy heart, as if something still pressed from within. Leela didn't return to the scientific base. She knew that if she showed up, she would be detained. She knew that if she told the truth, she'd be considered insane. She made her way alone along the trails until she found a village many kilometers away. There, silently, she secured transport to the nearest city, from where she flew back to Europe for weeks. Leela remained silent. She gave no interviews, published no reports, answered no calls. She isolated herself in a small apartment on the outskirts of Vienna, surrounded only by her equipment and fragments of the data she had managed to save, images, audio recordings, incomplete analyses. But every night, when silence overtook the apartment, she heard it, the same sound, the same pulse, coming from where, at first, she thought it was a side effect, a trauma, a psychological echo of what she had lived through. But then she realized that, when she brought one of her acoustic sensors close to the wall of her own apartment, the sound was there. The same frequency, the same pattern she had detected deep within the mountains. Leela froze, cold sweat running down her neck. Equipment checked, absolute certainty. It wasn't interference. It wasn't a defect. The hole hadn't stayed in the Altai Mountains. It was here. In the following weeks, she conducted tests at different points around the city, on walls, on foundations, on open ground. And in each of them, the same result. The frequency, the pulse, always present. As if the hole was not just a place, but a structure spread across the entire earth. Leela's mind began to collapse. The nights turned into endless vigils, monitoring graphs, analyzing data, trying to find some variable, some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. The pattern was perfect, constant, universal. In a desperate attempt to get answers, Leela sent part of the data to a former university colleague, a geophysics specialist. 3 days later, he was dead. An accident, they said, a fall down a staircase. But Leela knew. She knew the moment she received the email confirming his death. It wasn't an accident. She realized that she couldn't trust anyone, and that maybe she wasn't the only one who had returned. Leela began monitoring disappearances in different parts of the world. Cavers who vanished without a trace, acoustic researchers who died under suspicious circumstances, military personnel who deserted without explanation. The records were numerous, and all had one thing in common. Before disappearing, all of them reported inexplicable subterranean sounds. Leela then realized the truth. The hole was not an isolated anomaly. It wasn't a geological error, nor was it a structure created by ancient civilizations. It was part of the planet, or worse, part of something that was using the planet. A living structure dormant, or perhaps awake for far longer than humanity itself. And the expedition she had participated in was not the first. And, without a doubt, would not be the last. On Leela's computer screen, an alert, unusual seismic activity. In the depths of Antarctica. She expanded the report, and there it was. Frequency detected, 19.3, same pattern, the same sound, the same call. Leela knew what that meant. The hole was no longer a place from which one could simply escape. It was a state to call. And now it was everywhere. Leela leaned against the wall of the apartment, exhausted, defeated. But then, she realized she was no longer alone. In the mirror in front of her, a silhouette. Jonas, standing beside her. With the mark on his chest. Leela turned, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, he was still there, and behind him, the pattern, the spiral, the eye, the circle cut by the vertical line. And, for the first time, Leela understood. It wasn't a mark left by the entity. It was a door. And once you cross it, it never closes again. Leela smiled, said, tired, and whispered, I know. Leela could no longer sleep. She could no longer eat. She could no longer live the way she once knew. Each day, the frequency became stronger, more present. She no longer needed to use acoustic sensors. The sound was everywhere, pressing her ear to the wall, walking over the asphalt, sitting silently in her apartment. It was there, always, calling. She spent weeks trying to trace the signals, connecting seismic data, reports of disappearances, geological anomalies. The map she built was devastating. Emission points recorded in the Andes Mountains, the Mariana Trench, the Gobi Desert, the depths of the Arctic, the Amazon rainforest, and more recently, in the center of major cities. Paris, New York, Tokyo. The conclusion was inevitable. The hole was no longer subterranean. It was emerging, not as a physical crater, but as a presence, an invisible structure insinuating itself through reality itself, like invisible roots, wrapping around the planet. Leela understood, with a calm horror, that the opening of the hole in Central Asia had been only a trigger, a first breach, but that, in fact, there had never been just one hole. There were, and always had been, many, scattered, hidden, dormant, waiting for someone or something to awaken them. And the most unbearable of all, it was too late. Leela spent days locked in her apartment, listening to the sound, observing the pattern of the mark that, though vanished from her skin, now appeared everywhere, on the bathroom wall, on the rain-fogged window, in the mirror's reflections, always there, always watching. The circle, the line, the eye, and then the news of a structural collapse in a residential area of Paris. The reports were vague. Residents heard a deep sound, followed by an inexplicable tremor. When rescue teams arrived, the ground had simply disappeared. There were no obvious craters, no debris, only a perfect void with smooth walls, like those of the crevice in the Altai Mountains. Leela knew immediately. The hole was reproducing. Spreading. And the worst, no one would believe it. No one could stop it, because there was no stopping it anymore. She tried to warn them. Sent emails to authorities, to universities, to journalists. The response was always the same: silence, or reports that the recipients had disappeared. And then the sound changed. It was no longer just a distant pulse. It became a voice. First whispers. Then words. And finally a phrase. The same one. Always the same. You are now part. Leela knew what came next. She stood up from the floor of the living room, looked out the window, observing the sleeping city, and saw, in the distance, a beam of light emerging from the underground, silent, discreet, but perfectly geometric, a circle. Perfect, glowing with a pale, cold light like an eye opening. She walked over to the mirror and looked at her image one last time, and there it was, the pattern, engraved, not on her skin, but in the reflection itself. And then the floor of her apartment trembled. The wall behind her began to open, slowly, as if it were made of living flesh, revealing the same narrow corridor she had crossed months before, in the Altai Mountains. Leela took a deep breath. There was no more choice. There never had been. She took a step, and then another, until she was completely swallowed by the pulsating darkness. And when, finally, the corridor closed, there was nothing left. No scream, no trace, only the sound. The subterranean pulse that now no longer came from one place, but from everywhere. The hole no longer needed to be found, because it had always been here. And now here we are. You've listened to the story all the way to the end. But did it really end? Or is it possible that this was only the beginning? While you listened to every detail, imagining the underground passages, the inexplicable sounds, the translucent figures, have you ever wondered if, at this very moment, there's something right beneath you, maybe just a few meters down, a sound, a call, a pulse that your mind learned to ignore, but that now it can't anymore? Do you realize? The hole is not just an isolated geological formation in some remote corner of Central Asia. It is a structure, or a presence, that has always been here. Hidden, silent, waiting, until someone, maybe Leela, maybe you looked in the wrong place or too much in the right one, and heard what was never meant to be heard. But now there's no way to unhear it, no way to unsee it, no way to unfeel it. The pattern is here, the sound is here, the mark is on you. And as you try to rationalize, to tell yourself that this is nothing more than a narrative, a fiction crafted to entertain, consider, what if it's not? What if right now, the same pattern that marked Leela, that absorbed Victor, That swallowed Jonas is already replicating. Beneath your house, in the underground of your city, in the foundation of every structure you believe to be solid. The whole doesn't need to be seen to exist, it only needs to be felt, heard. And now, it's already in you. Before we end, try an experiment. When the video ends, turn off all the lights. Sit in absolute silence, and bring your ear close to the nearest wall. Listen carefully. Maybe you'll hear a pulse, maybe a whisper. And when that happens, remember, it's not the sound of your house. It's not the plumbing. It's not the wind. It's the whole calling, as it always has, as it always will. And you are now part of it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. But be careful, the more you know, the harder it will be to go back. Turn on notifications to be alerted when new stories like this are revealed. Or, when the whole decides to call you again, leave a comment. Do you believe the whole is real? Or do you still want to believe it's just a story? See you soon, or somewhere down below.